Okay, we are live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today, I am having a live discussion with the one and only Cosmic Skeptic. We are live. Hello, everyone. Oof, that's awful. So, Cosmic Skeptic, would you like to introduce yourself? I think your name's Alex.
That's right. Yeah, my name is Alex. I run a YouTube channel called Cosmic Skeptic, and also a new podcast by the same name. I'm a university student currently, studying philosophy and theology, and that's essentially all there is to me. I just make videos on the internet. People seem to enjoy the things I have to say, but I generally speak about philosophy of religion. That's probably what I was most known for. Recently, I made a video talking about animal ethics and veganism, essentially making a philosophical case for veganism as I saw it. And I saw your response that because I essentially like invited response and said, if people have a way to talk me out of this, then please do. And you didn't want to talk me out of it because you're a vegan, but you said, even though I sort of agree with your conclusion there, you disagree with the kind of underlying meta-ethics behind it, or had some kind of point stack with the philosophy. And I really enjoyed that because I love the idea of saying, I want this argument to be as strong as possible. So even if I agree with you, I'm going to sort of make a response and see where I think your arguments are flawed, even if I want the argument that you're presenting to be successful, because you want the argument to be as strong as possible. So it's only very recently that I've delved into to talking about veganism, but moral philosophy has been something I've talked about a lot before as well. So yeah, I think it's good to be here.
Yeah, and it's great to have you here. I mean, in that video, like first, I would like to say you've been far too humble. Cosmic Skeptic has over 250,000 subs. He's going to have some pretty big guests, I think, on his channel. I think you were hoping to get Earthling Ed on your.
Well, I mean, I'm reaching out to him. Well, I've sent him an email a little while ago, but I know that currently he's in the US giving lectures at Harvard and Princeton and are doing wonders over there. So I think he probably hardly has time to come on a podcast. My plan is to essentially wait until he's back in the UK and reach out to him. But yeah, people like that, I'd love to have on the podcast.
Yeah, and he's doing analytic philosophy and philosophy of religion at Oxford, no less. So I think that's impressive enough as it is, without anything else. But yeah, like back to the video. Yeah, so I made that video in response to Alex's, not because I have any problem with Alex's conclusions, but because I have problems with how we reach them, and it's essentially how we construct our arguments is very important, I think. And I think Alex will agree, being a philosopher, because I think when we look at how we reach our conclusions as philosophers, it's through a love of truth that we become, like, for example, we take any moral stance. If we do adopt any, I mean, some of us decide not to adopt any at all, and go down the routes of nihilism and stuff. But it's through a love of truth that would reach any of it, or a rejection thereof, and that's kind of how we'd reach nihilism, I guess. But the point I'm trying to make is that, yeah, as vegans, we want strong arguments. We want to help animals, but unless we say that there is an underlying reason to help animals, then we're just doing it because of a feeling. And I don't think that is, arguments aren't feelings aren't arguments. I think in philosophy we can't just write down because I think so. So I think it's one of those issues. But this led us to this discussion, because I criticized the meta-ethic behind Alex's position, primarily at the start of the video, and then further on at the end. I think I talked about your video with rationality rules. So I would like to ask you, where's your meta-ethic sitting right now?
Right, sure. So it's hard to stick a label on it. I mean, I stand by everything that I said in the video where I criticized rationality rules, who's a good friend of mine, and we've spoken about this privately recently, and we're going to be talking about it again very soon. Essentially, what his idea was something akin to, it seemed very utilitarian to me. It was trying to cross the is-ought divide when referencing desires. So Stephen seemed to suggest that, well, he rightly pointed out that there's no way to logically conclude an ought from an is. And he recognized that the only way that you can get an ought or a should, like a normative statement in the conclusion of an argument, is to have the same type of statement in the premises. It's like if you have an argument that says, you know, it is raining outside, therefore you should take an umbrella, that's illogical. If you have an argument that says it is raining outside, premise 2 is you should avoid getting wet, conclusion with a few added hidden premises would logically follow you should take an umbrella. That's a valid argument, but the problem is that it might not be sound because we don't know how to justify that should premise in the premises. Now, Stephen said that there are different types of should statements. There are different types of oughts. There are contingent oughts, which are contingent on something else. So the ought to eat healthily is contingent on the ought to survive, for instance, or to thrive. Whereas there are some oughts which he called axiomatic oughts, which he used the language of they're oughts that we just have. We just have them within them. And an example he gave was the ought to survive. He said, I don't reason my way into this. I just have it. And I pointed out that what you have is not the ought to survive, but the belief that you ought to survive. And that's not the same thing, because then the premise just becomes, it is the case that I believe I ought to survive. And that's just an is statement. So you still can't derive a should, because Stephen said, like, then you can construct an argument like premise 1, I ought to look after my children or whatever. That might be an axiomatic ought. And premise 2 is that vaccinations are good for looking after the health of your children. The conclusion is you should vaccinate your children. I mean, that's a valid argument. And he said, because the axiomatic ought is in the premises, we can say it's sound as well. But to me, it sounds more like I have a belief that my children ought to be healthy. If I vaccinate my children, then they will be healthy. All that follows is that I should believe that I ought to vaccinate my children. It doesn't follow logically that I ought to follow them. So the problem for me was crossing the is-ought divide, and I stand by that. However, yeah. I've been thinking a little bit about how it seems like I'm completely, like it seems like I'm just being difficult when I try to bring this in, but I think any ethical discussion requires a pretty important focus on the concept of free will. I don't know what your thoughts on free will. It'd probably be helpful to know before we go forward.
Yeah, I'm a compatibilist. That's normally where I sit. I don't think there's that much of an issue when it comes to discussing ethics with free will so much of late. Mainly because I was, when you read thinkers in the past, and I know I need to do more work on free will more than anything, because I know that I made me views quite a while ago, and I could do with reading more, as always. But one of the things I kind of take the position on, and when we talk about ethics, is like the concept of freedom of the will. Mm-hmm. So when we speak about ethics, it seems that whether the first cause of what is the way in which we think and reason is not ourselves, then it really doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, it does with the overall moral responsibility, but then when we have social interactions, for example, even if we took a hard determinist approach and somebody says, well, tries to make, I think there was a case, I think years ago, Clarence Darrow and stuff, where he tried to defend 2 people from the death penalty using hard determinism, saying that these people had no, I think it was behavioral determinism, basically. These people are raised in such an environment that they had no other choice but to commit this crime, that psychology was so built up that they would commit this crime. But then they did avoid the death penalty, but they still got punished.
Yeah.
But the issue I have there is that, well, why didn't the jury just turn around and go, yes, well, we're determined to punish them? The issue I see is that if we do live in a deterministic world, I don't think it necessarily changes anything that we already experience. We already understand the world. We already experience the world. Like, the more we theorize about it, like, it explains it, but it doesn't actually change the fundamental nature of what we're experiencing.
It gets complicated on a meta level when you start talking about, for instance, the jury could just turn around and say, well, we're determined to send you to death. It's like, well, if we understand the free will argument to be the idea that you're sort of determined by your desires over which you have no control, they just sort of appear in your brain, then by promoting an understanding of a free will philosophy, the jury would become determined to not punish that person with the death penalty, because you don't get to choose what convinces you. And if you're convinced by an argument because of its truth that there's no such thing as libertarian free will, then you will become determined to think in such a way that accords with that. So you couldn't be determined to sentence that person to death if it were really true that the psychology of the recognition that there's no free will would not lead a jury to do that, if you see what I'm saying. But the reason I bring it up in this discussion is because I think it's crucially important, even as a compatibilist, generally speaking, as far as the compatibilists that I've engaged with, have held a view that something akin to a recognition that yes, we are all determined in the sense that we don't have ultimate authorship over our actions. However, there's a relevant difference to whether that determination, that chain of determination, begins inside the brain or outside of the brain. That seems to be kind of all the compatibilists can do. Is that sort of what you're suggesting?
I suppose, yeah. I mean, like with it occurring inside the brain, yeah, I would say that the way that in which we reason and apply reason is determined by what is us, like the mechanism that
Right.
we are. And if I think to say that we didn't cause ourselves, and therefore we can't be morally responsible for it, I think I understand that ultimately that the moral responsibility for us being this way, in the way that we are faculties of reason, for example, someone that's incapable of reasoning correctly, let's say they have a mental health issue, I understand that they would have diminished responsibility even in a libertarian sense. But if we take that to be the case, I think that yes, we can acknowledge that you can't be responsible for those. I think actually in relation to what John Rawls says, you can't be responsible for those characteristics that you have.
Yeah.
But the overall the way in which you decide between this is going to sound somewhat dualistic, but decide between yourself is what I'm concerned with, because I'm concerned with how we the volition of being able to mediate between those desires in which we have.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where I would probably sit. It's kind of like I don't know if you've heard of like Hegelian conception of objective freedom, but the idea is the mediation of first order desires with second order desires.
Right.
And I would argue that second order desires are our willingness to reason. And if our willingness to reason engages with the concepts in which we are given, which produce who we are, then we can come to those conclusions which are better for us. And I think that when it comes to social responsibility, the reason that we're kind of punishing stuff in the first place is to try and reach the end goal. It's not necessarily for retribution. I don't agree with retributive justice, but I do agree with rehabilitation more than anything. So when we come, I think if that explains like me position on the matter.
Yeah. I think that there is an important experiential difference between jumping and being pushed, if you see what I'm saying. So I agree with you in that respect, but I don't think that there's a relevant difference in terms of relevance to morality, whether you shoot somebody or whether you drop your gun and the gun misfires and kills somebody. Like, in terms of your moral responsibility in a world of deterministic causation, there is equal moral relevance, I think, on either of those cases, unless we redefine morality to involve thinking about it in terms of what we should do in terms of deterrence or prevention, that kind of thing. Then you can see the difference there. But the reason why I think it's important is because even the compatibilists can recognize that you are essentially just a slave to your desires, and you don't get to control what those desires are. Wherever those desires come from, whether they come from your internal state of consciousness or whether they come from the external world, you're not in control of them. And actually, Peter Van Inwagen has a good point on this, which is he defines this concept called untouchable facts compared to touchable facts. And to the compatibilists, we sort of assume a compatibilist worldview and say that the touchable facts are the facts that exist within our brain. They're at least in principle able to be changed or able to be under our control. They're the ideas that we generally think of being under our own volition. Untouchable facts are things that nobody would ever claim have anything to do with free will. And he gives the example of the state of like the arrangement of atoms in the universe 10 million years ago. The fact that atoms in the universe were arranged so and so 10 million years ago is an untouchable fact. But he then brings up the point, which is that if you have an untouchable fact, and then you have another fact that is necessarily implied by the untouchable fact, then the second fact has to be an untouchable fact too, if it's a necessary result of the first. And determinism states that everything is a necessary result of something that came before it. So all of your psychological states were ultimately caused by something, and the chain goes all the way back to the state of the universe 10 million years ago. And he says, well, if the state of the universe 10 million years ago is an untouchable fact, and our psychological current states are a necessary result of that after a long chain of causation, then it must be an untouchable fact in our brains as well. And that's kind of the response to his response to compatibilism. Although disappointingly, as long as I'm not confusing him with someone else, I think he ends up just coming down on the side of saying, but it's all a bit of a mystery, so we'll never really know. But that to me is a very strong argument against compatibilism.
I agree. I think it's quite strong. I think the issue, the place of contention, I think there for me would be this idea that there is a long line of absolute causation to untouchable facts, and I would probably bring in like quantum mechanics for that there is indeterminism in the universe. And it seems to me that obviously this would breach our ability to change it, at least in theory.
Yeah.
Like I don't know about you, but I can't change the way in which atoms rotate. But if there was something that was quantum sensitive, I think a guy called Roger Penrose wrote a book called The Emperor's New Mind. And at the end of it, he says that, well, free will would have to be some way related to quantum dynamics if it was to exist. And he says that he's putting his leg out when he says it, to be fair. But if the dendritic spines in which constitute the tissue of our brains was superpositioned like that of quasi crystals, then there would be a superpositioning within our brains, which at the point of decision making. And he says it's important to recognize that like it's a neural receptor as it's either there or it isn't. It's either on or off, quite like a digital computer. And I think that's something interesting. And I think that's probably where I would probably disagree with the hard determinist, because I don't think that, don't get me wrong, I'm no neuroscientist, so I don't think I can support it with any empirical data at this point. But I think there is at least some reason to doubt causation, like absolute causation.
Yeah,
from the point
so would I. And I think so. Compatibilism generally assumes hard determinism. That's why they would call it compatibilism. The idea that free will is somehow compatible with determinism. But I think you've identified an important point, which is that if the universe is determined, then we definitely don't have free will because of the untouchable chain of causation. If the universe is indeterminate, that means it's random, in which case, by definition, we don't have any control over it. And those are the only two options. The universe is either determined or it's not. Or let's say individual actions, individual states of the brain are either determined or they're not. If they're determined, then they're the result of a long chain that ultimately ends up externally or ends up internally, but itself would be then indeterminate, the beginning of that chain. And if it's indeterminate, either at the beginning of that chain or just immediately, if it's indeterminate, then it has to be determined by nothing. And if it's determined by nothing, then it's random, and then we still don't have control. So the conclusion has to be, as far as I see it, that the psychological states that arise in our mind, including that of desires and motive to action, are out of our control. Do you think can we agree on that?
Yeah, I would say so. I think the only difference I would have, I think I do agree, but is the fact that the point in which this causal development occurs. So I would say that, for example, an individual's states of mind may have been caused by the changing of events within their brain, relating to like quantum fluctuations, which have then created their brain when they made their first decision, or when the actual effect preceded the cause. So they may have made the decision, because it's atemporal, isn't it? So they may have made the decision and then it's superpositioned in their brain, and then that decision's been made. And I would say that's beyond their control in any meaningful sense.
Right.
But then it gives a sense of individuality to the person involved, in which we can say that they're not necessarily the cause of their actions, but who they are is in relation to this causal indeterminacy that we can modify and change if we can. So if we can get them to make another choice, then they become someone else. Their brain changes in fundamentally. I don't even necessarily need to think of quantum indeterminism for that, but that's where I would sit with compatibilism, that you are the result of your brain, and then take it from there. So I think we can agree on that.
Yeah.
Really.
So there's no problem with compatibilism that almost kind of like redefines freedom to mean something different, to mean something like just the ability to kind of feel as though you are an individual and you are sort of the cause of your action in some sense of the word. But in the sense relevant to this discussion, I think that the free will that we need to have traditional moral responsibility can be said to not exist. But regardless of that, the point, the conclusion that we have to sort of get to understand the view that I'm espousing is this idea that the psychological states in your brain occur without you having any meaningful input over them, any conscious input, let's say, over the development of desires that arise in your brain. You can't choose which desires arise in your brain, and even if you could, you'd have to desire whatever it is.
Yeah, like a want to want. Yeah.
And that just goes on forever. So you will have this. All your desires in your brain are completely out of your control. Like, the next step is to recognize that anytime we do something volitionally, it is as a result of our desires every single time. And that includes something like, if I hold a gun to your head and tell you to go and rob a bank, like, you could, like, in colloquial terms, we'd say that I'm forcing you, but I'm not. Like, you're still choosing to go to the bank. You're making the choice because you desire to rob the bank more than you desire to be shot in the head. Now, why is it that you desire to go to the bank more than to be shot in the head? You just do, and you can't choose to change that desire. And if the desire was stronger to be shot in the head, then you'd allow yourself to be shot in the head. Like, that follows logically. So if you're not in control of your desires and your desires motivate your action, then you're not really in control of your action. That's kind of the free will argument. So the second step is to talk about what is it that people actually desire. And this is where I agree with the utilitarian, the psychological utilitarian case. So when I read Mill, I don't like his. I mean, I say I don't like it. I'm growing more sympathetic to his chapter 3, Jumping the Is-Ought Divide. But I very much agree with his identification of pleasure as the only thing that is desired in itself. I don't want to cross that boundary to say it's therefore desirable. But to say that pleasure is the only thing that's desired in itself, I think is fairly reasonable. If you desire a meal, you don't actually desire the meal, you desire the pleasure that's going to derive from that meal. There are things that you seem to do that aren't pleasurable, like going to the gym, but you are actually desiring the pleasure of good health, and the desire to be healthy is outweighing the desire to be sedentary, if you see what I'm saying. So
yeah, I very much agree with that. Yeah.
Right. So you'd agree then that pleasure is the only thing that's desired in itself.
Yeah, I mean, like, but when you say, like, obviously, when we talk about, like, unable to change our values, I guess the issue I would have is the difference, but the mediation between values is where I sit, and I think that the faculties in which we use to mediate between them, whether it's an illusion that they're volitionary or not, for example, like application of reasoning and deliberately, like, thinking about what we actually want and so on, lets us work out whether we want to go to the gym, for example. So if we want to work out, we because we want better health, whether it's in our interests. And that's where I would sit in the terms of moral responsibility. Moral responsibility comes down to the idea of not necessarily to the point of absolute value propagation, but or conceptualization, but rather the mediation between these conceptions.
Right. So, if I'm the reason why that I'm trying, it seems almost irrelevant to kind of have a discussion on what's the nature of desire and to have a discussion on whether free will exists or not. But the reason, and I know we've been going on for a while now, because you just asked me if you could just, like, let me know your meta-ethics, and we're still talking.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
The reason is because to me, these two things fit perfectly well together to get to something that does lead to a kind of absolutist recognition that certain actions are indicative of someone being right or wrong, and they fit quite trivially together for me. So the criticism that I had of someone like Stephen, firstly, was to say that yes, there are things that are desired. That doesn't mean they're desirable. But secondly, to say, when he had this idea of axiomatic oughts, I'm like, if axiomatic oughts mean anything at all, which is the belief that I ought to do something, the only actually axiomatic ought that exists is this ought towards pleasure, because everything else is actually just a derivative of the desire for pleasure. So the first criticism was there's only one axiomatic ought, not many, and that is the ought to, achieve pleasure or maximize your own pleasure. But secondly, that even if you desire that strongly, and even if it's the only thing that can be desired, that doesn't make it desirable. So I take it down a different course. And bear in mind, Stephen and I were talking about this conversation in isolation of the free will element. But when you put the free will element into it, it all starts to make sense to me, which is to say, look, if all of your actions are motivated by your desires, and we know that because it's the only thing that can be desired, what you desire is the maximization of pleasure. And I know as a matter of fact that when you do X, you believe, as a matter of fact, it necessarily follows that you believe that X will maximize your pleasure. Because you will always act in accordance with your desires, and your desires are to maximize pleasure. So whatever you do, if you do X, I know for a fact that you believe that X is maximizing your pleasure. Now, you're either right or wrong about that. Like, pleasure is a conscious state of the brain which can be measured, maybe not in practice, but in principle. And that's the kind of meta-ethical point. It doesn't matter if we can do this in practice. But in principle, there is a right answer. Like, doing X will either maximize your pleasure or it will not. Now, if you're wrong and X doesn't maximize your pleasure, the only way that you could fix that belief is in such a way that you would then act differently. Because if you believed that actually Y maximizes your pleasure, then necessarily, because of the free will argument, that's what you would do. So whenever you do anything, it is necessarily indicative of a belief that you hold that's either right or wrong objectively, that can only be fixed, rectified in such a way that would cause you to act differently. Now, that is,
I think we'll agree with that. I think we'll both agree on that.
The thing is, that's practically indistinguishable from ethics, but we haven't actually crossed the is-ought divide. We're still completely in is statements. I'm saying that you doing this indicates that you are right or wrong objectively in such a way that can only be changed if you acted differently. But I'm not actually crossing the ought divide. But I think we can retain language like should and ought. If I say, I was thinking about this a lot, like, what do I actually mean when I say you should do this? I think what I mean when I say you should do this is something akin to, if you could see things the way that I saw them, you would do this. You should go and help that lady across the street. It's like, look, if you could see this the way that I was seeing it right now, like you would go and do that. Like it's like an opinion statement. It's like, this is what I would do if I were in your position. This is what you should do.
I think the issue is like with this, I would say that when I say should, I don't mean to say you should see things the way I see them. I mean, although that's in what is being invoked, even when I'm acting rationally, if I'm imposing reason, because I'm still seeing it like based upon my reasoning. But I guess the way I would use it is say that by the dictates of reason itself. And I would say that the rational concepts we hold are typically in language and are objective of any given individual. So I wouldn't be saying like the way that I should see, like the way like you should see things the way I should, because that sounds somewhat prescriptivist.
Okay.
I would say you should see it based upon the conceptual understanding of what right and wrong, good and bad, all of these concepts which you're using to make the decision-making process actually go on in your head. Take a step back, analyze what those concepts mean, and see whether the grammar actually fits what you're actually trying to work out. Whether if you were to put it into a sentence, whether this proposition is coherent.
Yeah, so I actually fully agree with you. I don't mean it's kind of a language thing. That's not quite what I meant. I don't mean to say that when I say you should do this, I don't mean you should see it the way that I see it. What I mean is, when I say you should do this, is if you did see it the way that I saw it, then you would do this.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
For instance, like if I think that it is just logically true that you should do this, then when I say you should do this, I mean, if you could see this the way that I saw it, then that's what you would do, because you would see the logical consistency. And for my kind of meta-ethical underlying, it would be something like, when I say you should do this, I think that that's what's going to maximize pleasure. And what I'm saying is if you could see that the way that I saw it, that was actually going to maximize your pleasure, then that is what you would do. And that's like a fact. That's either true or false, because if your action is really determined by pleasure, then if I say, if you saw things the way I saw them, you would do this. Like that's just true, because I think that this will maximize your pleasure. And if you thought that it maximized your pleasure, then you would do that. So
I think the main place we might disagree is would you say there was a way that you should see it? Or would you say that's impossible?
That's the line I don't like crossing.
Yeah.
That's why I still stand by all my criticisms that I had before of Stephen, and all of my criticisms I had before of objectivist morality, because I don't think you can. It may be the case that there is some objectivity in ethics, but there's no way for us to, like, epistemologically, and I know that's a separate question, but I can't trust your assertion that there is such thing as objectivity in ethics unless you can show me the reasoning that led you there. And I would say that the closest we can get to actually crossing the as-ought divide is a form of moral subjectivism, where the subjectivism doesn't lie at the level of the action, but at the level of the desire. So if we all agree that pleasure is good, which we do, just as an intuitive, it's almost like by definition, we believe that pleasure is good, then that might just be purely subjective, and we might be right or wrong about that. Like, if there is such thing as objectivity in ethics, then we might be wrong, and it might be the fact that pleasure is actually bad. But if we all subjectively believe that pleasure is good, then I can say as an objective matter, then I can put that in my premise. I can say that pleasure is good, like you ought to strive for your pleasure. Like, you can put that in your premise. And then you can construct a logical argument because there's an ought in the premise, you can get an ought in the conclusion, and it objectively, logically follows. So the subjectivity doesn't lie at the level of, like, if I say, don't throw acid in the face of a young girl, like, you might say, well, if you're a moral subjectivist, and I can just say, well, actually, I think it's good to throw acid in the face of a young girl. So that's the problem with subjectivism. Well, no, because the subjectivity is the subjectivity that we all think pleasure is good. And the person who wants to throw acid in the face of a girl also thinks that pleasure is good. So I can objectively reason that you are wrong because I know that you believe that you should be maximizing your pleasure. And I also can show you logically, at least I hope so, that, or at least in principle, that there is a way to prove whether or not throwing acid in the face of that girl will actually maximize that pleasure. And if it doesn't, then you are wrong in accordance with your own subjective desires. So the subjectivism isn't lying at the level of the action. So it's not a problem when people turn around and say, well, what about people who believe awful things? Like, if it's just subjective, then how are you going to talk them out of it? Well, quite easily, because the subjectivity actually lies at a level on which we all agree. But a universal agreement is not the same thing as objectivity.
Yeah. I mean, that's universalism. I mean, that you basically said it right there. I mean, that's epistemic objectivism. Actually, I've got a nice photocopy right here because I had to take the book back of Ayn Rand, and that's where it sounds really similar to Ayn Rand. Not in the same way, because obviously she talks a lot about life, and obviously we talked about that, but it's happiness itself, and I think that's what she was arguing for, and I think it's where we would agree that the end. Okay. You're just doing that on the screen, are you? You're gonna do that to us.
Sentient beings are determined by their pleasures.
You see him, I can't make an argument against, but that's right. Like, in the sense that I can say that, like, using objective reason, I can convince you based upon your own pleasure and your desiring that there is a better way to fulfill those desires.
Yeah, but
that's where we agree.
That's just still not objectivism to me. It's like, if we both subjectively agreed that blue is the best color to paint a room, and we were trying to argue over what color to paint a room that we were sharing, I could, like, objectively reason, like, with you and conclude that we should paint the room blue. Like, it logically follows. If we should strive to have blue as the sort of pinnacle color, and we want to find a color that will serve our interests or whatever, then yeah, we should paint the room blue. But it's still only subjectively true that blue is the best color. But yet we can still have this kind of pseudo-objective conversation around it, because we both agree on the base level that blue is the best color. But we can't say that it's objective in a meta-ethical sense, because there's no way to justify that we should favor blue outside of just our subjective desires. Now, that's the same thing for pleasure. The difference is, with pleasure, it's like having a world where every single person in the entire world believes that blue is the best color. Like, we'd be having the same debate in that world over, like, when somebody goes and commits this great evil of painting a wall red, we'd be here saying, like, having this discussion and saying, well, is it objectively wrong for them to paint the wall red? And you'd probably be reasoning, well, we can say that it's objectively wrong, yeah, because we all know that we all think blue is the best color, and we can show this person how them painting their wall red acts out of accordance with that. Like, yeah, we can, but that doesn't change the fact that just because everyone believes that blue is the best color, that doesn't make it an objective fact. And it's the same thing with pleasure for me.
You see, I see where you're coming from, but I guess my main point of disagreement is, for example, in the objectivist ethics, there's this understanding that what we prefer, or what we think we prefer, isn't necessarily what we will prefer. So I would say that for the person that's painting the wall red, you might or even the people who think that the wall being blue will be better, what they first have to ask themselves is, will this being blue bring me happiness? Will this being red bring me happiness? Like, will it bring me the most pleasurable experience? And that's when we'll start rational conceptual evaluation, isn't it? Where we start going like, are these conceptions right? And then that's second order desires, because we start like looking and we start rationalizing about our desires. I think Hegel said it's like a lens looking through a lens. We're looking at our mind itself and we're analyzing whether the mind itself and those what seemingly innate preferences we have are actually the preferences, quote unquote, we should have. Now that's where I would say, when I talk about ethics, it's what desire is actually in my interest to invoke. And I say that's why I would say there's a separation between what I would call interests and preferences. And that's where you would agree, where you'd say you could make a rational argument that it would that there is a case for well-being, for example, for the average individual, that you will maximize your own well-being by maximizing the well-being of others. Well, I agree with that, but I guess the difference is that it's still ontologically subjective, because you would say that, or not, well, yeah, ontologically subjective, because you'd be saying that you're trying to maximize your own end in the long term. It's not about happiness as a simpliciter. It's happiness, happiness at simpliciter. It's happiness for you. And is that why you'd say that it was subjective in the overall scheme?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, like, you've identified where the analogy with like color breaks down, which is that you say, well, if everyone agreed that blue is the best color, we can say that there might be a case to make that actually they're wrong about that, and blue isn't going to maximize their pleasure. The analogy was trying to draw an equivalency between blue being at the basis of subjective ethics or determining action, and pleasure being at the basis of determining action. So to ask, in that universe, does blue actually maximize pleasure? In that universe, blue is the foundation, as pleasure is in this one. That's how the analogy is trying to work. So you only get the sort of second order of desires when you can make that extrapolation. But there's nothing to extrapolate from pleasure, because that is the very basis.
I would agree. I think even Immanuel Kant agreed, didn't he? He said the rational end of all beings is happiness.
Yeah. So like, I mean, everybody who I sort of respect in ethics tends to have some conception of pleasure being at the basis of it, and it's either going to be something like, you should, as a matter of ontology, value your pleasure, or it could be, God created you in such a way that the fulfillment of pleasure is the natural end, or it could be like the rational way to live is in accordance with pleasure, or it could be the kind of view I'm espousing, which is just without any ought component at all. But whatever it is, pleasure is at the basis. Like, that seems fairly logical to me. But what I'm trying to do essentially is construct a way of thinking about ethics, or at least a context in which to think about action and whether it's right or wrong, in a way that doesn't need us to get bogged down in the meta-ethics of crossing the is-ought divide. Because a system in which I say, you doing this indicates that you're wrong in such a way that can only be changed if you don't do that, it is practically indistinguishable from me just saying, don't do that and do something else instead. Like, it's the same practical effect. But when I say you shouldn't do this, and someone says, well, what's your justification? If I have to break them down into meta-ethics, you get into a big discussion, you're not going to get anywhere. If I can prove to them, just as a matter of fact, like in objectivity, that I know that you doing this means that you are wrong, it's kind of like an agent-based theory, because I'm not saying the action is wrong, I'm saying that the action indicates a belief that you hold that's wrong. But it's still not really ethics or morality, because there's no ought component, but it is agent-based. I wouldn't need to get bogged down. There wouldn't need to be any space for controversy or disagreement, because as a matter of just fact, objective fact, I can say, I know that you're wrong, and I know that to correct yourself, you'd have to do something else. Like, that's the best practical way to get through ethics, and that's the reason I've constructed this now, or I say I've constructed. That's the reason I'm sort of in agreement with this, or have come to this line of thought. To me, it's like a separate discussion to talk about meta-ethics and whether there can be such thing as should and should not. And that's the discussion we're kind of having now.
Yeah.
And I think that what it comes down to for me, and this is what I spent a lot of time thinking about, was when I studied the the problem of induction, right? Sort of like one of the first things you do as an undergraduate philosopher, you do the problem of induction. How can we reason from the unobserved to the observed? How can we say that just because we've observed the sun rising every day so far that it will rise tomorrow? Well, we can't. We just can't. It's one of those questions in philosophy, like, how do we know we can trust our senses? Well, you can't, but we just kind of do. And I suddenly realized, I was like, well, this comes from David Hume, the same guy who promotes the is-ought problem. It's like, so here he is saying you can't get a will be from an is. This is actually something Stephen pointed out to me a while ago as well. He was like, yeah, okay, so Hume rightly points out you can't get an ought from an is, but you also can't get a will be from an is. But we do that all the time. And I thought about it a lot, and I realized, well, okay, the reason why we trust induction is because all of us just subjectively agree by like necessity. We just have this subjective agreement that induction is accurate. And therefore we talk about facts like the sun will rise tomorrow as if they're objective. Why don't we do the same thing for ethics? It's like we all subjectively agree that pleasure is a good. And so why don't we just talk as though that is an objective fact in the same way that we talk about induction as though it's subjective, or our sense experience as though it's subjective? That's the only and best argument I can find to actually cross this divide. But then the only way to cross that divide is not to provide a logical argument from how to get an ought from an is. It's to recognize that we can't, but to recognize that to be consistent with where we do it elsewhere, we just have to, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I see. I think I see what you're saying. I think. I mean, I think we agree. I think for the most part, I don't think we'll have really any major disagreements. I think I mean, on whether we should use the word "should," maybe, but but I think when we look at, for example, I was just thinking like I'm thinking more like epistemologically. When it comes to like how we reason and how individuals reason as a whole, I look at it in this respect. It is true objectively that everyone seeks pleasure, and I think that it's that okay. Well, maybe to prove it fundamentally true that everyone definitely does seek pleasure, but I do think that is I think qualitative experience cannot be denied, and I think by desiring and having because I don't really think we can doubt that there is at least some qualitative experience, even if we invoke a Cartesian level of doubt, we'll kind of come to this point where we'll go, actually, there is definitely something desiring. We can't say it's us, for example, but we can say there is a desire.
Well, I think that's the Cartesian level of doubt, isn't it? To recognize that no matter how far you go, you have to recognize that there is something doing the desiring.
Yeah. And I think when we get to that point, what we realize is that, okay, and based on the fact that desiring exists and that it is an action urging process that moves us towards that which is of the highest qualitative experience, that more qualitative experience, like a higher value, is better than a lower one. And so we end up with this like, okay, we'll have positive and negative. More positive is better, less positive, like more negative is worse, where we'll go, okay, we want to avoid pain and seek pleasure. And I think that's where you end up with almost like a Benthamite understanding of like hedonistic morality.
How can you justify that? Like, how can you say that just because there are such thing as preferences and there's something doing the preferring, it's better to have more positive than negative? Like, where's that coming from?
I would say that you cannot help but value it as good. Like it's not, but I mean, like if we say you, I mean, obviously then I'm gonna have to give a defense for like the agent themselves.
Oh, no, I mean, like, you can reasonably say the thing doing the desiring can't help but prefer the positive, the things that bring it pleasure.
Yeah,
that's fine. But like, why does that make it better? Why should we act in accordance with such a way that?
Well, I'm saying that's where we would agree. I think that you would probably say that there was no choice but to evaluate it as a higher degree. That you would go that this greater experience is more valuable.
Yeah, well, it's more valuable to us, but that to me is still just a subjective preference. This is like what Sam Harris has as the basis of his morality. He said a number of times, he's like, you just have to recognize that a world in which there is the maximum possible suffering is bad. And it's like, I see what you're saying, but it's bad in a like we would think it's bad. I would think it's bad. And like we wouldn't be having this meta-ethical discussion if we were living in that world. We'd rather just say, I don't care if it's not meta-ethically justified, get us out of here. But if we're looking at it objectively, there's no way to reason from the fact that we all prefer to avoid suffering that we ought to avoid suffering. So yeah, the thing that's doing the desiring necessarily must prefer pleasures to pain. Like that's just definitionally so. But it doesn't follow that we should, therefore, or let's not say we, let's say they should. Let's take ourselves outside of the experiential zone, and just say from a perspective of complete neutrality, whatever it is that's doing this desiring, this conscious existence, it has a preference, and its preference is always for the positive rather than the negative. But it doesn't follow that it should act in accordance with the positive. Unless you mean should in the sense which I was saying earlier, which is to simply mean like it would act in this way with this like type of knowledge. If you mean should in the traditional sense, which is just kind of indefinable, it's one of those meta-ethical problems. Then it just doesn't follow for me.
I mean, I think like, I mean, if I try and explain further, I suppose, like, if we understand that this individual, let's say, from this point of desiring, they would have maybe some baseline understandings of values that maybe, for example, a child, like, you know, they have inbuilt fears like tabula rasa. I don't think it's true. They have some inbuilt fears where they'd say that, you know, the fear of falling. That's something they could not help but want to avoid. You know, they don't want to fall over because it's naturally that they will. But then you get people in the future that'll skydive. It's how they reach this position in which there is a change fundamentally in their conceptual evaluation that I'm interested in.
Mm-hmm.
The individual who begins from a position of wanting to seek their own pleasure, I think that is fundamentally true. You're seeking your own pleasure, but how you do it is what forces us into a language game so that we can understand through reason what will bring us the most pleasure. And that's where we seek truth. We seek truth to understand why, like, we don't seek truth. I don't take a necessarily fundamentalist view that truth is valuable innately. I do think truth is probably more likely to be valuable as a means to an end. And I think that given that, what we do is we seek this language game out. We seek the reason itself to understand how we can achieve our ends as great as possible. But the thing is, what we must do when we seek in this language game is what we end up questioning is the ends a lot of the time. Are these ends truly what I should be seeking for? Now, we can't question pleasurable itself, but what is placed over what is pleasurable is normally an ideal, a subjective ideal. This is what I think, like, people like Nietzsche come in, and then it goes, why is the threat of nihilism so real? Because it's what you are driven towards innately. You can't help it. And then when you start pulling these things into question and there's nothing to replace it, well, then you're left in this position where you're desiring and you're maximizing this subjectivity, but towards what? Nothingness. So it comes to the point in which there will be an ontological goal that we are driven towards. And I think that goal, if we look at where we reason, is an Aristotelian one, because we start questioning our own lives and we come like, okay, the good life for me, how do I reach the good life for me? So when we enter we start understanding ourselves as human, and we start implying identifiers and ways of understanding ourselves. And these concepts in which we use to understand ourselves are then internalized. And we start saying, well, I know that I like rock music, so I'll call myself a rocker. And that way, when things are put into that category, it lets me understand that I will enjoy all of these things. Sometimes it does limit our experiences as well. So there's something to get into there. But with identifiers and conceptualization, we come to understand ourselves at a greater degree. And the thing is that this is purely subjective so far. Like, I'm not saying anything different, but I think the difference is that these aren't induced, these are deduced. And that's where we enter moral objectivism, in the sense of epistemic objectivism. Now, I guess the difference where I would go between an epistemic individual, subjectivist ontologically, and an objectivist ontologically, is what we place over these goals in which we seek. Because I would say that the concepts that are created within language aren't created by single individuals. They're created by groups of individuals. We use these concepts and come to conclusions that, for example, I might say that what I want to do is maximize this goal and that goal, and this will be better for me. But I think eventually those what we consider the highest pleasure, the greatest good we seek, which we place an object over, and is the fundamental driving force of all of our desires. I think Aristotle said it best, where he's like, you can start with whatever you want, but then you're going to end up with something different by the end. Like, you can have this ontological drive to seek, you could seek warmth and avoid cold and everything like that, and then you might have a family, you'll have experiences that'll change who you are, and then suddenly your concepts of good and bad have changed. Now, I would say that this is what happens, and that these are formed through sociocultural education. These are political, and we'll internalize concepts such as liberty, such as equality, and these will begin to replace our individual happiness. I think we'll reach a point in which the concept of our own lives and our own subjectivity is removed, not necessarily from how we are deciding, because we'll say that, yes, we are important, but that it's not the only thing that matters. We have internalized other individuals' well-being as valuable, and that ultimately rests upon us and in us. But these ontological constructions are from language, and they're not individual in that induced process, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I hope that explains it.
To rewind, you're suggesting, it seems, that like the objectivity in ethics is the process of deducing objective facts about oughts and normative behavior from this baseline of pleasure, essentially.
Mhm.
And earlier as well, you said you can't question the pleasure part. It's like, well, why not? That to me is the sticking point. Like, I think I completely agree with you in other objectivist ethics. And I actually think that most people, when they criticize moral subjectivism, it's the version of moral subjectivism that says that the deductive process is actually subjective. It's not, it's inductive, They say that, like, yes, we all desire pleasure, but it's just subjective whether this will bring pleasure or this will bring pleasure. Like, no, I agree with the objectivist case that you can deduce objective facts about what will maximize the baseline of pleasure. But I think you can question the pleasure. You can't question it in the sense that, as a human being, experientially, you can't question whether or not it's actually what you desire. Of course it is. It has to be. But you can question it by taking a step out of that and looking at it objectively and saying, how can we know that is a justified belief? Well, the fact is that we just can't. That's where the subjectivity lies for me. But outside of that, I completely agree with absolutely everything you're saying in terms of deducing moral conclusions in an objective manner that's verifiable and at least in principle provable and even demonstrable to other people and able to convince them to act in certain ways because of it. But the very baseline upon which it's all based is where the subjectivity lies. And I think that has to ultimately be a subjective preference. But it's
I agree, but I think that the foundations of epistemics mean that the maximum level of agreement and application of reason will mean that the greater expression of subjectivity for all individuals ends up being at a greater degree of certainty for you as the individual. So what you seek is this maximum point of epistemic verification, and that will entail a society with the least contradictions. I think Hegel says it like where it's almost like where your decision making process is less in contradiction. Like those where you stop and you go like, wait a minute, what am I doing? He says,
exactly.
like, you lack that, what he calls tragedy. He says, I think he says it, was it, tragedy is not a confliction between right and wrong, but a confliction between two rights. And I think that is essentially where it's a difference. Because he thought Kant was a subjectivist. He was like, Kant's a subjectivist, man. He's telling me to reason, use my own application of reason to purely by myself to induce what is like going to be good for me. But without verification from other people, I have no idea whether this is right or wrong. So that's when he come up with like what rather than aesthetic idealism, subjective idealism rather, it would be objective idealism. This idea that the goal in which we seek is not something that we create by ourselves, because if we create it by ourselves, we have no way to prove whether it is the goal we should seek in reference to what we are forced to be seeking.
Yeah, I totally think that for me, it's a matter of consistency. Like when it comes to talking about ethics to other people and trying to practically convince them of moral conclusions and things like that, the question is one of consistency. I can't say you are objectively wrong because of the fact that I believe that what is at the basis of all ethics is subjective. But what I can say is that objectively, I believe you're being inconsistent because I know that you value your pleasure, and I know that you think that you should maximize that pleasure, and I know that what you're doing is not maximizing that pleasure. So you're being inconsistent, and that's kind of the argument you make. Now that translates as just saying you shouldn't do this, but that's essentially what that means. The other translation of you should do this is the kind of well, if you saw it how I saw it, you would do this. But I think you're right that it's about it's a matter of consistency. The other problem is that, like, and this is what I've been kind of struggling with, is that if this is not objective, then really nothing can be objective, or at least we can't know that anything's objective, because any objective fact about the universe that we can think of ultimately comes down to, at least epistemologically, a trust in a subjective trust in whatever we're basing that upon. There is a slight difference, which is that I think that sort of by definition, by principle, as a matter of analytic fact, desiring pleasure has to be subjective. However, where it is the case that so something like pleasure is good, is I would take a sort of non-cognitivist approach, because I'd say, well, it's a subjective, it's a desire. It's not an objective analytical or synthetic fact. When it comes to, like, is the Earth orbiting the sun? Well, we know that it either is or it is not. So we can have some objectivity in that basis, but epistemologically, still, the only way we can justify whether it is or is not is by our subjective agreement that our senses are accurate. And if it's always useful questioning the very basis of everything, but questioning the basis of ethics is very similar to questioning the basis of epistemology, or questioning the basis of induction, or whatever it may be, and we'll ultimately find that it all just breaks down to a subjective trust in these faculties. And if that's the same thing for ethics, then I think we probably have to look at ethics with the same level of objectivity as we look at epistemology, which is like, which essentially that level is, we, in general philosophizing, treat it as though it's objective until we're sort of talking about the meta subject, in which we all just kind of throw our hands up in the air and go, God, isn't that really annoying? I think that's what we kind of have to do with ethics as well. And that's why I'm grateful to Stephen for opening my eyes to that and saying that maybe going forward, it does make sense to call myself a moral objectivist, because I'd call myself like an epistemological objectivist.
Yeah, that's like a universalist, like Ayn Rand or something like that. Yeah.
So that's the only way in which I'd probably call myself a moral objectivist. But to me, that's all terminology, and it's difficult to stick a label on it. And the ethical view that if you asked me to speak about ethics, like if you told me to give a talk on it or make a video about it, I would probably do it in the lens of the sort of views I was talking about earlier with the free will component and everything. And because that doesn't cross the is-ought divide, I don't need to worry about whether or not I'm calling myself a moral objectivist there, because I'm saying that to me, ethics is more useful when thought through this lens of there being no free will, because this is an ethical system that not only works without free will, but necessitates there being no free will. Because if there were libertarian free will, then we couldn't sort of see what determined action, and it wouldn't indicate right or wrong belief.
I think even if there was a libertarian free will, to be entirely honest with you, that this would still apply, because I think what this is the valuation in the first place. Like, and I think that even if there was libertarian free will and you could, if you could act in a way that would not maximize those values which you seek to maximize, like let's say you could like because I don't actually agree with this. Like, I don't believe that you could have a desire that's not yours, for example. It doesn't make any sense. I guess they would probably try and make the argument like, no, this is entirely yours. But I mean, if you look at it like that, like this idea of like absolute freedom, like Hegel even says, like and other thinkers, I mean, this is like Sartrean like level freedom in some respects.
Yeah.
This leads to absolute like no causation, which is like, if you do actually set up anything, you'll be like, I think it was described as almost like Buddhism or like Brahman, where you're it's literal emptiness. Like there is nothing there, because if you do try and say that you should value anything, then you're going to have this, like, you should value that which gives you freedom, for example, and that should be uncaused. Well, there will be no concepts there to like let you value anyway. The way I described it is, it would be like the difference between a vector and a scalar. So like, let's just assume that like this was true. You would have the maximum level of magnitude that would be your subjective freedom. You would be like willing with greatest potency, but because you would have no direction, you would lack any ability to, what Nietzsche says, discharge your strength upon the world. There would be no subjectivity actually there. You have destroyed your subjectivity anyway, because what you'd have done is removed any way for you to actually discharge what it is that you want. It would be like the will that wills itself, in like the Ubermensch is empty.
I don't think we run into this problem, because to me, libertarian free will is like conceptually incoherent. Like when you speak to people who have some idea of what compatibilism means, what determinism means, and you say, well, what do you mean by libertarian free will? They go, well, I mean the ability to control what you do. Well, no, I suppose it would be like the ability to do what you want. Well, no, it can't be that. And there's just no, like, what does it actually mean? Like, no serious philosopher really is a libertarian. I think like some recognition of at least compatibilism to me is the implicit recognition that free will doesn't exist, but I don't want to let go of it, or I can't let go of it, or I still experientially like know that there's something there that's relevant. That's all compatibilism is to me. Like, I think that you don't have to necessarily be a determinist, but when you recognize that the only alternative to determinism is indeterminism, and you have no control over either, you've got a big problem with free will. So I don't think we have to worry about the contradictions that come up with libertarian free will, because it's just conceptually incoherent, I think. And so once we've recognized that, it makes sense to view the world through the lens of truth. And if it's true that we don't have control over our actions, then it makes sense to look at ethics through that lens. And when we do so, I think that I can construct an ethical framework that necessitates there being no free will, so we can view it through that lens, but also doesn't cross the is-ought divide, so we don't need to get bogged down in meta-ethics, and yet has the practical equivalency of still being able to say you should do this, you shouldn't do this, or talk about right or wrong, and justify a criminal justice system and this kind of thing. So I think that's a really useful way to do it. But if I were forced to have the meta-ethical discussion, as we've just had, not that you forced me, but I it was quite fun, I'd probably come down on some kind of something resembling objectivism, with the caveat that only to the level of the objectivity of our senses or whatever.
Or like epistemology itself, almost.
But we can avoid that entirely. You know, I think we can avoid it by looking at ethics in a different context. But whether or not we do so might have some practical implications that I haven't anticipated. For instance, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, like, it's very easy to make the case that treating other humans well or valuing their well-being is actually good for your well-being. You can read the Selfish Gene, or you can read The Expanding Circle by Peter Singer, or whatever you like, and see that it makes sense that even if it's like irrational to care about somebody in another country, you can evolutionarily explain why we do as like a byproduct of the survival of the tribe or something like that, which itself is a byproduct of the survival of the person, which itself is a byproduct of the survival of the gene. What's difficult is when you, for instance, if we bring like animals into it and talk about veganism, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about whether or not you can make the same arguments to say that actually a maximization of animal welfare is like is a logical derivative of maximizing your own welfare or pleasure. Like that's not as easy an argument to make. It's easy to make when you have someone who's empathetic. You could see, again, like empathy for animals is a byproduct of our evolutionary empathy for other humans, which is an evolutionary result of our survival of our own genes and our own tribe. So a sort of byproduct of that is empathy, and a byproduct of that empathy is empathy for animals, and therefore we maximize our pleasure to do so. And I think that when it comes to factory farming as it exists at the moment, it's very easy to make that case, which is that if you're aware of what's going on, then I know that you have enough empathy that if you were fully aware of what was going on, then you would know that the best pleasurable thing you could do would be to stop eating animals. And therefore what I'm saying is, if you could see the world as I saw it, then you wouldn't eat animals. And, you know, ergo, with the language that I'm trying to use and construct, you should not eat animals. I think that can follow. But it's not an easier case to make, but I think it can be done.
Yeah, I think that's it's a decent argument. I think, like, obviously I think the difference is that, for example, my my consideration for moral senses would be different. I think with the way that you look at it, it's like if you have empathy, meaning that you consider animals to well, you consider other beings as valuable and that you care about others. Pain and suffering, that if you were aware of this pain and suffering, you would be incapable of caring. You'd be incapable of avoiding the care that you would feel for like those animals. If you saw slaughterhouse footage, you care and so on like that. I think that's a decent point. I think that's a lot of vegans actually pull down to. They're like, do you have empathy? If you have empathy, well then, can you help? Could you help but care for these animals? And I think that's a fair argument to make. I think the difference is, sorry.
So I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just going to say that there are people who don't have that empathy.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of people who don't have that empathy. However, I think epistemologically we could make the argument for like based on what is good for the individual, as including other animals and other individuals. Because I would say that the concepts in which we use to how to understand ourselves and even understand what is good and how to achieve it, the values in which we seek, these are built in language. These aren't something that we create. Like, we don't understand. We are given, for example, those base words in which we use to evaluate the world. I mean, I know that's a sofa and a dog behind us, but I didn't make the word sofa and dog. It's exactly the same way that we understand all objects and objective states. And I think that bearing that being the case, that we can say that the conceptual development of our language is really the development of morals. That's what I would point it to. That it's a rational conceptual growth.
Yeah, a lot of language at the basis of this, and I recognize the importance of language, but I don't place it in with the same. I don't place it with the same importance. I think that the experience, I'd rather say, than the concept of pleasure, because I think pleasure is an experience rather than a concept. Just as like in the same way that Moore said, we can't define yellow in the same way we can't define good, but we all know what yellow is. It's almost implying that yellow is an experiential thing rather than a concept, because we can't define it or explain it to a blind person. It's an experiential thing. I think the same thing of pleasure. So I don't think you need the language in order to have the experience. You need the language to make sense of it and to communicate it with others.
Yeah.
But if you were the only person on the planet, and Wittgenstein said there can't be such thing as an individualistic language, which I think is an interesting and perhaps accurate point to make. Without that language, without that communication, you'd still have an experience of pleasure, and there would still be the same kind of conclusions that I've drawn previously about, like, there are facts about what will maximize your pleasure, and you are either right or wrong about these things. There'd be no one to tell you as such, and there'd be no one to recognize that, and you probably wouldn't recognize it yourself, but it would still be the case. So I don't think you need that language. The problem is that when you do reduce ethics to essentially just this pleasure-based view and experience of pleasure, well, what do we do when we get those people who simply aren't empathetic to the suffering of animals? Well, I think the answer to that is perhaps there are many people who genuinely aren't empathetic to the plight of marginalized human beings. When slavery was being abolished, there were probably many human beings who genuinely just had no empathy for Black people, none whatsoever. But what happens is, as the cultural tide sways, the argument doesn't become it's within your best interest to free your slaves because you have empathy for the slave. It's within your best interest to free your slave because your pleasure will be maximized by being in good standing with a community of people who do have empathy for your slave. So you can kind of take that next level. So if we say that there is a tipping point at which the majority of people on the planet recognize the empathy they have for other animals, which I think does exist as an evolutionary byproduct. Again, I think it's entirely irrational. I think it's entirely irrational, evolutionarily speaking, to care for certain animals. I mean, there's no reason that I should care for a cow's well-being, except for the mild fact that it does share my genetics, but only as much as a chicken does or a banana does in a meaningful sense. And also, like, the argument that we're making is one of like pleasures and pains and sentience. That there's no reason that I should care about that cow's sentience in an evolutionary sense beyond that very basic level. However, if I recognize that I do have empathy as a byproduct of that, even if it's rational, then it becomes rational and in fact a necessity for me to not eat meat because of the fact that will maximize my pleasure. And you get enough people doing that, And what happens is when you take the person who really is unempathetic to animals, when they try to go and kill and eat an animal, society will turn against them because of their empathy for that animal.
Yeah.
And so it becomes in that person's best interest, and it will maximize their pleasure. Even if it would really be pleasurable for them to kill and eat the animal, it's more pleasurable for them to be in good standing with their community. So
Yeah.
once that tipping point is met, where a majority of people recognize their empathy, then the rest of the population who don't have that empathy will want to change their ways anyway. So I think that's probably the way that things would have to progress. But that means that the empathetic argument has to be at the forefront of the conversation as that movement is occurring.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, pragmatically, that is absolutely true. I think that's the case. Like that is how we would. That's how it will probably occur. I think there'll be a point when, for example, let's say 80% of the population is vegan. It's likely that legislation will eventually be passed where this was not allowed anymore. Animal slaughter and exploitation would not be okay, or not be seen to be okay. But on a even as a like, I can't help it as a philosopher, and I think you'll probably feel the same. You'd still want to convince that person that there is an underlying falsity to their actions, because that's what I think is actually occurring. I think though that individual who even doesn't have empathy, that I think would be by Schiller would call him the savage. That person that runs on emotion too much.
I think that's something that we need to try to let go of. This idea that we just, one of the reasons why I think so many people like moral objectivism, that those people I mean who haven't thought about it much and just kind of choose their ethical theory which seems most intuitive, is because of this fact that they just want it to be the case. Like watch I don't know, Prager University's videos against moral subjectivism, and all they can come up with is something like, but if morals are subjective, then how can we say that Hitler was wrong? Like it's just not. It's like, well, like that's.
You see, I think you can say Hitler was wrong though.
It's a separate issue as to whether you can or whether you want to. Like you said a second ago, like wouldn't you want to be able to convince people that there's a?
I was saying I couldn't help but want to, but I mean, in reality, I would say that if I was to say it in language that was like more stern, I would probably have said that it is actually not going to bring them any form of happiness, and that I would take happiness to be a eudaimonic expression of virtue. Virtue is tied into that, and I think that's because the way that the concepts that are tied in our language, as I've said, allow us to understand what is the good life for us. I think that's when Alistair McIntyre says the good life for me becomes the good life for man, and I would argue that the good life for man becomes the good life for sentient beings. It's a conceptual development.
I'm not sure that you can actually bridge that gap in the same way, because.
Do you think there's any gap being breached there? I mean, I think this is good that we're onto veganism now. So do you think that veganism, especially, do you think that would bridge any gaps?
I think there's more of a bridge to gap in terms of ethical extension or ethical rationality, let's say. There's more of a bridge to gap between non-human animals and other animals than there is between the individual and other people of the same species. And the reason for that is because of the evolutionary development of the desires which are at the basis of ethics. So pleasure is the basis of ethics, and our experience of pleasure is something with an evolutionary history. So if you start with the logical assertion that you'll act in accordance with your pleasure, it's not too difficult to recognize evolutionarily why it's beneficial to have the pleasure of other human beings tied into your own pleasure. It's more difficult to recognize why you should have the pleasure of other animals, especially in an instance where in our evolutionary history, there was a time where we really did have to kill animals to eat and survive, in which case it would make sense to have the evolutionary opposite. And maybe that's why we currently live in a situation where most people don't intuitively think that it's wrong to harm animals, except for when one's put in front of them. But it's something you can quite easily be trained out of. That's more of a cultural thing than a genetic thing.
I guess this is the point. When you say you could be trained out of it, I would say that who we are, really, what is our human nature? I don't believe in a fundamental human nature so much. I do believe that we'll have no choice but to will and seek that which is desirable. I would say that's true of humanity, but I don't think human nature is for example, what we want. Wanting is something we cannot help, but what we want, that's in relation to our socio-political environment.
Right.
And I think that we say that people a lot of the time say that this is an illusion, And I think that even like in Buddhist terms, like it's like the self is an illusion. But I don't think so. I think that this is who you are, and then happiness is tied into who you are based upon the logical concepts that form the socio-political culture in which you understand yourself.
Okay,
And that when we forward those concepts and those institutions develop, we'll find that the rational conclusions in which we understand our own happiness have been tied in all this time to this. I don't think that we can divorce ourselves from the judgment of, let's say, British values. I don't think, like, a lot of the time my values will be British values, but even if they're not perfectly British in the sense institutionally, they're certainly British values tied into the language culture in which I've been able to converse with other individuals and develop the values that I'm able to hold. Because I don't think you can just induce yourself. I don't believe in. I think that would require libertarian free will.
Yeah. Okay. So, but look, so if you think that it is easy enough to extend the moral logic to non-human animals, like how do you do that? I mean, if essentially what we're espousing, I think, could be called ethical egoism, and ethical egoism, it tends to have some pretty nasty connotations, but I'm talking about the kind of ethical egoism that recognizes that you need to truly understand what is actually in your best interest in order to really act egoistically. But we're essentially arguing for ethical egoism here.
Yeah.
How do you reason? I can see how you reason from ethical egoism to care and empathy for your fellow human being. How do you reason from ethical egoism to care about the suffering of a pig on a farm?
Yeah, I mean, like it depends on, like, for example, how you're arguing for the care and consideration of of other individuals. You would say that, okay, it's in your best interests, because you value um that you will value your own life, and you
What,
build it up from that position.
what if
And
we
then how
what if we saw it as like a byproduct? So I recognize that um, it's difficult to talk about what's in your interest because evolutionarily we need to look at it from the viewpoint of the gene rather than the individual. But at the very least, let's sort of put that aside and say that when we philosophize, we're talking about the level of the individual rather than the level of the gene. So therefore, it is a byproduct of the gene's own survival evolutionarily to look after other members of the tribe who share the majority of your genes and to care about those genes far over the genes that could compete. Like, it makes sense evolutionarily that I care more about, like, my mother than I do about a random stranger because, like, I share more genes and I want those genes to be carried on. It makes more sense that I care so much about my child. Morally, it doesn't. Like, morally, from an objective moral statement, I should give no precedence to my child over someone else's child. But we all know that you would just do that, and the explanation for that is an evolutionary one. And it's just a byproduct of the gene. It's not necessarily actually rational for the individual to care about other human beings, but they do it as a byproduct. Now, I don't think you can say in the same way that it is a useful byproduct to care about animals. Like, what is the moral extension of that logic?
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, I would say that, like, one, I think we can't look at this as a too individualistically. I mean, don't get me wrong, I think we should, in the sense that we're why individuals are motivated into reasoning. But reasoning's not an individual endeavor. Like, logic isn't something that is indicative of us and our capacity to use rationality. It's rationality itself. And I think that when we enter this state, we enter what Levinas calls the we. And he says that we go from, well, like, I go from a place of understanding the totality of my existence and how I think, which gives me, when we enter the we get this objective world where we can say, like, is this the case? And then we can turn to somebody else for verification. And this is where the we develops. And this is where our concepts of language develop. Now, I think that when we understand ourselves in this we, and that, like, it's, for example, it's me and you, it's me and you against the world, and then suddenly we start making reasons where we're like, okay, so it's better that I would want them to consider me in a position in which, like, I would want somebody else to be in this group because that way, if we create, let's say, a deontological structure, we could say that nobody kills anyone, and that way these 3 people, these 4 people, these 5 people, we're not killing each other. The only thing that ties us in together, for the most part, our reasoning is based on not necessarily our desires, but our moral consideration. You kind of look at it in the sense that, who should I morally consider? Like, what is justifiable? What would I say? And then you will say, like, it's my desires. They'll say it's their desires. But ultimately, the foundation is desire. And that is the only uniform foundation in our reasoning that is held within this we. That desire itself holds value.
So I see what you're saying, which is I think I do anyway, which is essentially like, we recognize the universality of desire being at the basis of everybody's morality. So let's not look at it as my desire. Let's just look at it as desire as a concept.
Yeah, it's like I think the best way to explain it is the categorization, the rational categorization of desire as being the decidera for judgment-making processes.
For me, is that with the due to the arguments that we began with and the arguments that I presented, I think you can only think in terms of your own desire. You can't think about desire as an abstract concept. You have to just act in accordance with your own desire. So you would have to reason in order to, and like I said, I'm willing to make a concession of this desire to desirability. I'm willing to make this concession that because we all share this desire, we can say that our own desire is objectively the best thing. But I'm not willing to make an even further jump, which is to say that because my desire is good for me, everybody's desire is good for me. That seems a completely like extra jump. And the problem is that whereas I think I can say another human being's well-being is best for my desires, it seems that you have to say that a pig's well-being is good for desire, but you can't say that a pig's well-being is good for my desire in the same way that I can say that another human being's well-being is good for my desire.
I kind of would. I would say that, like, your desire leads you into this situation where you indulge in epistemics, and that is based upon categorizations of how to achieve your endeavor. It's categorical. If we don't have categorical decision making, like, decidera, then we wouldn't be using reason. We use concepts, and we produce these deductive arguments. The thing is that, like, in the case of history, what we use is various other understandings of how to represent intercommunication, intersociality, and the consideration of each other's desires to create what is good. So we say, like, oh, well, I care about the well-being of British people. I care about the well-being of Europeans. I care about the well-being of, and it's all to forward the understanding of what is the underlying concept behind all of the decision-making process when it comes to happiness, which is desire. And I think that, don't get me wrong, you would enter it only valuing your own desire. But once you've entered there, you are still valuing your own desire. But what replaces ontologically the concepts and desires of happiness in which you hold are those in language. You start understand, not only do you understand yourself in of the way, but the way to achieve your own happiness is only possible with these rational conceptual developments. And that is the pressure of history, as Hegel calls it, that these develop. And I would say that, based, like, for example, if we take the principle of equality that we use to justify that, I think that is essentially the fundamental basis of equal consideration of desire. And that's what Levinas kind of points towards, that, like, there is a fundamental equality between two individuals entering a language game to prevent war. Essentially, we don't want to murder each other, so we enter this language game to try and achieve our own ends. But when we enter this language game, we start seeking a combined end. And it's what this combined end is that is of question. And so that's how we ended up with, for example, equality. Now we had equality, we're all born equal under God, that kind of like Christian equality. But this developed quite quickly over the course of about 1,000 years to consider marginal groups and stuff like that. So we'd start saying, like, oh, well, women, the reason that we consider men is the same reason we should consider women. Are we willing to reject are we willing to reject the foundations for considering men, or are we willing to accept women? Or okay, we're willing to accept women.
The main point that I essentially tried to make was this one of consistency. It's like, because again, this is where I think where we disagree, and the problem that you picked up with my video was whereas I'm sort of saying this is a matter of consistency, this is a matter of acting in accordance with your desires, and you say, but isn't there a need to have this ability to say that what you are doing is just wrong? And the disagreement is like, I don't think you need that to make an effective case, because you can make this case of consistency without needing to actually say that any of this is objectively wrong. You can just say, look, I know that you believe that racism is wrong. Why do you believe that? Whatever that justification is, just apply that to animals and you'll probably get the same conclusion. Now, we could be completely wrong about it, but you can make this consistency argument. So there are two parts to it for me. The first is, I know that in accordance with my desires, because I desire my own pleasure, and my pleasure will be maximized by veganism because of the fact that I have empathy for animals, and because of the fact that I have a subjective value of truth, because knowing the truth brings me pleasure. And I know that it is true that there's an inconsistency between my views on racism and my views on speciesism, unless I sort of treat them in the same way. So I'm led to the idea that I agree with veganism. Then there's the second question of, well, given that, how can I talk to somebody else about it? Well, the answer is this argument of consistency. And that argument of consistency will be enough for them to recognize the error of their ways, even if that error is only in accordance with their own subjective thinking. And to me, it doesn't matter whether or not I can say, oh, and by the way, that consistency that you now hold is objectively good. I just have to say, you're holding a consistency, and I'm happy that you're holding it. And all I can do is what makes me happy. So that's fine by me. And I think it's going to maximize your pleasure too. And that's good for you. And what's good for you is good for me in a roundabout way, because you're a fellow human being. I don't think you need to have this objectivist basis. You might need it yourself, and in which case I would find whatever reason you're using to get objective morality and try to apply that to animals as well, as you've just like tried to do for me, essentially. Like, if you came across someone, if I was a moral objectivist who wasn't a vegan, you could say, well, what's your rationale for moral objectivism? It applies to animals too. Like, okay. But if you're not a moral objectivist, then I think I can just as easily convince you that veganism is the right course of action, just a different method. And I think that that's really what matters. So the issue you picked up of kind of, with the moral subjectivism, you can't make this absolutist case for veganism. Like, I think you can, in the same way that, because pleasure is only subjectively desired, we can only say that it's kind of objectively true that that you should be like acting in accordance with that pleasure. Like, I can say that it is absolutely wrong of you to eat animals, but only because of this sort of consistency at the basis. But it's the same kind of thing. It's like, yeah, it's all only about consistency and not objective right and wrong. But in accordance with that, you absolutely shouldn't be eating animals. I think you can do it either way, and I don't think it actually makes too much difference which route you take.
Yeah, I mean, I think we agree for the most part. I think it's when you get into the meta and people start questioning the meta, I think, as you pointed out before, that's when we'll probably need to invoke these arguments. And I think the reason why I got into it in the first place, a lot of it in many ways, is because the main reason I heard for people not doing what I would consider now as the right thing in general to them and to everyone, is because they would be like, well, I'm a subjectivist.
Yeah.
Okay. And then, like, the fact that you're an ontological objectivist, I think that's the rational place to hold. I don't think you can actually be rational. I think even Aristotle pointed this out in like Book Gamma, the Metaphysics, where he's like, if you don't apply the laws of logic and then you start making an argument against the laws of logic, you're going to apply the laws of logic. And I think this is the point. If you don't accept any epistemic norms, you will fail. Your arguments will fail. And it's this how that I'm concerned with. The fact that there is people that will go and try and double back. They'll go like, oh, maybe black people shouldn't have rights. Do you know what I mean? And there's people who will be like, they'll see progression and they'll just want to run from it. They'll be, it's better to lose the rights of other people. Like, I'd rather consider myself in this absolutely subjective framework where I maximize that which is best for me, and I'll seek to achieve that to the greatest ends. And everything else, it's like, okay, well, disabled people, black people, women, they all have extrinsic moral value because I live in a society where I have to maximize my own well-being. They don't have intrinsic.
Yeah.
You see.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
But you see, where I would situate is I would go, well, how do you seek to achieve that well-being? And then I would take them from there. I would be like, okay, since you seek to achieve your well-being using reason, these are the dictates of reason, and these are given by your language culture, and like your language game. And I would go through that level of thinking. I guess that's what really motivates me.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, to be entirely honest with you, it's great to hear that you're engaging with the topic so well. To be honest, with such a high degree of with like genuine sincerity, that you're willing. What was it that inspired, for example, like you to travel into veganism as an understanding of like to care about veganism, really, like to care about other animals and such.
Well, it's nice of you to put it like that. It was essentially, I think it was reading Peter Singer's Animal Liberation, which I only sort of I was on holiday, just like somewhere in England. We just went to a nice kind of town just with the family to be there for a week, and I just got accepted into Oxford, and I thought to myself, I should probably just read up on a bunch of general philosophy to prepare myself to be going to university. And I downloaded a bunch of books. I was downloading Language, Truth, and Logic. I was downloading utilitarianism. I was downloading all onto my Kindle, just all these kind of classic texts, whatever. And then I came across Peter Singer on the recommended reading lists, and they were recommending him for his book Practical Ethics. But I'd heard of Peter Singer's other book, Animal Liberation, and I'd heard that it was more interesting and more seminal and everything. So I thought, well, I may as well download that too. And just by chance, I just kind of like opened it on my Kindle while I was sat outside. We were doing this tour to like Agatha Christie's home or something, and we sat outside. My family went for a walk. I couldn't be bothered to go on. So I just pulled out the Kindle, and the first book there was Animal Liberation. I clicked on the button, and I read the preface or the first chapter or the introduction or whatever it was. And that was it for me. Because all that Singer did was pointed out the inconsistency that I was holding. And that's why I think this is important, right? Because whatever my reasoning is now philosophically, like the reason that I even began thinking about this was because Singer just pointed out an inconsistency in my thinking. And I was like, my God, this is bad news. A lot of time sitting on it and talking to people. Then I kind of forgot about it. And I thought it would be interesting to make a video about it one day. But then I suddenly realized, as I started trying to script a video, it's like, as soon as I put this video out, I'm essentially just going to have to go vegan, because there's no way that I can, the case that I feel I can make now, because of how strongly I think about this, like there's no way I can make that case without being called a hypocrite, because the case would just necessarily be so strong. So it took a while for me to make sure that I was actually thinking the right way. And for a long time, for a few months, I think that I knew what my opinion was. I knew that I thought veganism was the morally sound way to live, and I just didn't want to say so. I wasn't ready for it. And then I just thought, look, I can't put this off any longer. So I did it. But it's an important point that you made, just to rewind briefly, that if I'm making the subjectivist case about consistency, you're right to be worried that in the same way that I can say, well, if the logic that justifies racism also justifies speciesism, the two options are either to stop eating animals or to think that racism is actually justifiable. And there is a genuine concern that people could just move in the other direction. But I think we could have that conversation at that stage. We've already had that conversation as a society. And remember, we were at that stage not too long ago, only 100 years or so, or maybe 100, 200 years ago. We were at that stage of genuine non-moral consideration for other types of human beings. And we've had that conversation, and we've already finished it, right? So if somebody now were to look at the conversation and say, well, actually, I suppose the same logic that justifies not being racist also justifies veganism, I should probably be a racist. Like, society's going to turn around and say, no, don't do that. We've had this conversation. We've finished. Like, the only direction to move in is the other way. So I don't think that's something we need to worry about
You'd think, but you'd get into conversations with people, and people are really, some people really like the way of life, and I think I've entered some conversations with people where they're more willing to let go of those things that we would consider just inherently wrong. We would be like, okay, everyone thinks racism is bad. There's so many people that would. This is why I care a lot about metaethics. Obviously, I don't think everyone does, and I think for the most part, like I'm really just talking about the outlying cases where I'm trying to convince those people that would be harder to convince of anything. Um, so I guess it's one of the, obviously it is right that this society has made these conversations, and I think it is important that we've come to these conclusions. But it's the fact that a lot of the time when we do progress, and I think Aristotle points this out, no matter when we, and Hegel points this out, when we reach the point of tragedy, when we reach this point of the confliction between duties, where we understand that there is a confliction in the way we're thinking, where institution can either progress or be destroyed. The tradition can either be progressed and forwarded into something like veganism, or it can be annihilated as a whole.
Yeah.
I don't think that something like equality would be annihilated. I like to think it wouldn't. I think there's too many people who care about it.
It might be annihilated in the mind of the individual, and that's what we have to be worried about. Like, it's not going to be societally annihilated, but it might be annihilated in the mind of the individual who reasons in the opposite direction. But I would just say that, like, look, the situation, like you say, there are people who genuinely would reason in the other direction and come to a rejection of opposition to racism or something. And it's like, but that's the same situation we were talking about earlier, where we had the majority of the world empathetic to animal suffering and some of it not. Well, there's always going to be that minority, and it will still be in their best interest to act out of accordance with that thing that they believe, because it will maximize their well-being. So if somebody reasons the other direction, the reason I said society would jump on them is to say that even if somebody somebody could watch my video and become convinced that racism is justifiable because of it, like completely going for, but like they could be like, oh, I see the reasoning, but let's just go in the other direction. And it's like, okay, but even if you are now just convinced that racism is justifiable, it will not maximize your pleasure to act in accordance with that, because you live in a society that generally doesn't agree with you. And it's the same thing that can eventually have with something like the eating of meat. So I don't think we need to worry too much about it, except in the case of individuals. But individuals can be spoken to, individuals can be reasoned with and argued with. And if we're talking on a societal level, we don't need to worry, because the majority will push the desires in that direction because of the overall pleasure. And if we're talking about the level on the individual, then we don't need to worry, because we can actually talk to individuals in the way that we can't talk to a society. So either way, I don't think it's something to be concerned about. But the main focus right now should be like, just have the conversation, you know, like
I agree. Yeah.
People know, like, it's really strange. I started reading this book. It's called something like Eating Animals, Should We Stop? And I can't remember who it's by, but it's a fairly new book. And I remember picking it up, and people saw that I was reading it, and it's like, oh, you're reading one of those vegan books again? And I was like, yeah, you know. And then in like the first chapter, the author says, by the way, like, you assumed that this would be a case against meat eating, didn't you? And I thought to myself, yeah, I suppose I did. And he points out, like, the book is just called like Should We Eat Animals? But picking it up, like, you knew that this was going to be a case against meat eating. Like, how did you know that? And you realize it's because, like, everybody knows that as soon as you actually start thinking about it, you're going to come to this conclusion. Like,
yeah, that is somewhat true.
Not fund an investigation into the meat industry because they just know what the outcome is going to be. And so it's as simple as, I think, getting the conversation on the table so that people just have to recognize the either the ignorance that they've had of the issues before, whether that be willful or not, or the intellectual dishonesty that they've displayed before, or the moral inconsistency that they've had before. I think that you have to have one of those things in order to not be a vegan. And I think that the majority at the moment is just a genuine ignorance. Like, people just don't think about it. Get that conversation on the table, and I think it will be way easier than people think to get the world thinking in the same way.
I completely agree. I definitely agree. I mean, obviously, like for very similar reasons. I think that a lot of the time people epistemically are just avoiding it, like just within day-to-day understandings of the world. Like, you try and explain to someone, like, most of the time, the problem isn't convincing people of veganism in an argument. the most of the time it's getting them to have the argument. You talk to someone and they're like, no, don't want to hear it, don't want to see about it. You show someone animal agricultural footage, for example, that's the worst. Like, you say, like, if you looked at this, if you took the time to just see this suffering, you would understand this to be bad. And they're like, get that out of my sight.
That's a really interesting point. Like, it's not about, like, where you say it's not about constructing the best argument. It's about even just having the argument. I was talking to someone yesterday who, it was over dinner and it just came up. And we were talking about it and they sort of went like, oh, I don't really want to talk about this right now. And your instinct is to say, of course you don't want to talk about it. Like, why not? Like, this is a big issue. But I just said, like, yeah, like, I totally get why you wouldn't want to talk about this. Like, okay, let's not talk about this. Like, if I were you, I wouldn't want to be talking about this either. And they were like, what do you mean? It's like, oh, well, like, I think we all know where this conversation is going. And I can see if I were in your position, I'd much rather just dip out of the conversation. So yeah, let's put it to the side. But whenever you're ready to talk about it, just let me know and we can. And that just made my point for me. It was a bit like, it came across probably less sarky when I actually did it in conversation as it did just then. But I was making a point with that, which is like, yeah, of course you bloody don't want to talk about this. Like, why would you want to talk about this?
Yeah, it seems like it's almost shameful to people. Like the know that there is something that they're doing that doesn't confide with their belief systems, their understandings of the world, but they definitely don't want to change the way of life, and so they hide from it. They're scared of it. And I think that, like, the fact that people will avoid conversation shows a lot. Like, I think it's only philosophers typically that I've seen argue against veganism. I mean, you get now and again, you get like fringe cults, like cultures and stuff, like the carnivorous movement, very small mind. But like, you get people like that who will engage with vegans. But most people who come across vegans, like vegan activists, they either just walk past as fast as possible with their eyes to the floor, or the will realize what it's about and then just be like, oh, well, that's your opinion, goodbye.
I think a lot of people also just hope that one day society will force them to catch up. Like, they're like, I'll just wait until society adapts. I'll just wait until, companies have lab grown meat. I'll just wait until there are way more vegan options and it's more normalized, and then I'll feel a lot better about doing it. And the realization has to come that the only way you're going to sort of get companies to do that is by forcing them to economically, and the only way to do that is to abstain from eating meat. But yeah, I think the reason why people are scared of the conversation, like you say, people don't want to change their lifestyle, they're scared of the conversation. I think the reason they're scared of the conversation is because they know deep down that if they have the conversation, it will lead to the conclusion eventually of them having to change their life in at least one way, even if it's just don't use meat that's farmed from a particular farm, or just go vegetarian and still eat dairy. Like, even if you only convince them of a tiny little piece of the puzzle, like, people don't want to change their minds. And the reason they won't go into the conversation is because they know before they've even begun where they're going to end up. And that says enough. Like, that says enough about the issue. And that's exactly why we should be talking about it, I think.
Exactly. And I think as well, just to exemplify that, I think it's sad that people will avoid it to such a high degree, because even if, like, let's say society does go vegan and, let's say they do catch up through, the changing institutions around them, and they let other people make the decisions for them, essentially, they move with the market rather than trying to make the market move. Well, then there's a very good chance that when they're older and they're eating these plant-based alternatives, they'll harken back and they'll harken back to the days when someone tried to stop them in the street, and they'll go, no, I don't want to hear about it. And that's going to cause some, like, guilt. Like, I think that'll cause some, like, existential, like, issues with how they'll live their lives. And they'll go, like, I was the person, who when there was something going wrong and I didn't want to stand up for it. And that's how you would understand yourself. You'd start seeing yourself as this person who, and knowing that people would be criticizing, because let's be honest, they're grandchildren who are going to grow up with a total different set of ideological beliefs, who understand animals as equal, and they start thinking like, well, why, like, people now go like, I would have been against slavery, and everyone says it.
Right.
But I think veganism is indicative of the fact that
Yeah.
no, you wouldn't be unless you're willing to stand up for one and not the other.
That's exactly how I put it. And by the way, I'd make this the small concession in case people are watching and will pick me up on this, because I didn't say that in my video. Like, I don't think future generations will need to see animals as equals. I don't even think it's necessarily rational to see them as equals, but only equals in terms of equal levels of pain and suffering. You don't need to see them as equal in order to see them as having moral worth. They don't even need to have the same moral worth in order to have some moral worth. But yeah, when I started reading Singer's book, it was around that time. I came to the realization, because like I said, I was reading it on my Kindle, and I was reading it that day, and we traveled around. When we went for dinner that night, we went to a harvester, and I got some big meaty dish with loads of chicken and pork and everything. It was like a mixed grill or something. And I was I was reading this book like at the same time, and the meat came, and I suddenly realized, like, if this meal had been prepared by a slave in the kitchen, and we were living in a society where that was normalized, I'd be sat here eating it. And I felt so ashamed of that fact. And I started phrasing it in terms of where I'd previously said, like, gosh, if I'd have been against racism in the past, then I should be against animal welfare now. I should be against animal rights and or animal eating now is what I'm trying to say. If I was against racism then, I should be against speciesism now. I reframed my way of thinking about it into the way that you just put forward, which is like, well, look, I'm not a vegan now, so I can't say that I would have been against slavery when it was normalized in society. And that is awful to think about. And you talk about like the shame and the guilt. Like, I felt that a lot. You know, I felt so shameful of the fact that I didn't want to engage in this conversation previously. The only refuge I have is to recognize that you can't necessarily hold people morally culpable if they're just not aware of the severity of what's going on, and most people simply aren't. But I'm ashamed that I was willing to walk past protests and not watch YouTube videos and not listen to the speakers, because I just kind of didn't want to hear it. I felt that guilt and shame myself, and I feel like a good way to make up for that is to try and use the platform that I have to open that conversation to a new audience. But I don't think I'll ever be able to repay the suffering that I've caused with something as trivial as my previous diet. And that's a horrible realization. And having had that realization fairly recently, I completely understand why other people wouldn't want to have it too. Like, it's not a nice thing to go through. But it feels like and somebody who works in an abortion clinic suddenly becoming convinced that abortion is the gravest moral ill of all time. They'd probably have a complete breakdown, thinking they've been the author of so many abortions, and now they think it's totally immoral. Like, it would be a similar kind of experience, like something that you're doing every day, and you suddenly realize that you think it's immoral. It would just be earth shattering. And that's why people want to avoid the conversation. But that's why I think it's also so important when we have the conversation to say, look, I understand why you haven't thought about this previously, and I understand why this is a difficult conversation to have, but it's not as difficult as you think to make this transition.
Yeah, I mean, excuse me, 100%. I think that, like, when you bring up, especially, like, you know, that person in the abortion clinic that is doing something they just do not, that conflicts with how they see the world, like, that they come to this conclusion that, like, this is wrong, this is something abhorrent, that they would have this breakdown. And honestly, I think that we're already in that situation with animals. I think with abortion, I think a lot of the time people realize is that, you know, there's issues with it perhaps not being a fully developed fetus and stuff like that, and that it's not sentient and so on, and that's where what ethics kind of derives from a lot of the time. But with and I'm actually, just to clarify, I'm actually not like pro-life. So when I say, just in case I sounded pro-life,
Yeah,
there,
like you don't have to be to, because the point I'm like.
Yeah, I know exactly what you. No, I completely understand. I was just saying, because what I said there sounded like I was like trying to, like, no, bro.
Internet, someone will clip you, kind of clip you saying it. But yeah, I just like pick it to people listening. Just pick any issue you like. Like, imagine the other way around. Imagine someone who's been pro-life all of their life, preventing women from having abortions, and suddenly realizes that that's a grave moral ill. How awful they'd feel.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess the point I was trying to make was about slaughterhouse workers. I've got a video that I'm doing right now, actually, and I had to look into slaughterhouse workers. And I was thinking, what should I title this video? Because I looked into it and I was like, oh my God, like, this is awful. This is, like, not for the animals alone. Like, I mean, I already cared about the animals, but for the workers. I
Yeah.
was like these workers. I decided to title it like "Working in Hell" because that's what it is. Like these people go to work and they kill thousands of animals a day, right? And a lot of these people go in with the understanding that they care about other people, that they care about not causing suffering. A lot of them wouldn't walk down the street, and kick a dog. And they get into these facilities, and they're handed a really sharp blade, and they're told to slit 300 animals' throats a day, or stab them in the head. And there's testimonies which I'm including in the video, which of just slaughterhouse workers just explaining that almost everyone they know that's a slaughterhouse worker is an alcoholic. That almost everyone they know that's a slaughterhouse worker is like abuses drugs. Or there's testimonies of them saying that they have dreams of extreme paranoia where there's eyes looking at them, cows standing over them, saying like, "Why have you done this?" There's absolutely horrible cases. A lot of these people have problems with sadism and anger. They start becoming sadistic and liking to hurt people and hurt other animals and stuff like that, and actually enjoy hurting the animals at work. And testimonies of how they torture animals for fun, and that they develop like sixth sense of humor and stuff like that. Because I mean, if you look at like the conceptions of how the self develops, and that when you change the world, you're going to internalize part of what you've done in the world as yourself. You start to understand yourself by your actions. I mean, we do that all the time. Most people understand themselves by what they do. They're like, well, I'm a police officer, I'm a nurse, I'm this, I'm that, the other, and these have certain qualities attached to them.
Yeah.
When you're a slaughterhouse worker, these are quite negative qualities.
That's a really interesting. I'd love to sort of delve into the psychology of a farm worker. I'd love to perhaps get like an ex-farm worker on the podcast or something. But I think that'll be a great video. So yeah, anybody who's I'm sure that this video, because we're live streaming now, but I presume this video will still be available on your channel.
Yeah.
So anyway, because anybody who's come here because I've sort of shared the link or whatever, I'd recommend subscribing to this channel, because that sounds like that's going to be a good video.
Oh, thank you. I mean, obviously, I would like to say without any hesitation, like obviously subscribe to Cosmic Skeptic, but I'm not going to lie. If they found me, they found you.
So sure, because the audiences are so different. If you're talking about because if you're here talking about veganism and things, and people who otherwise are interested in philosophy or philosophy of religion or something just don't want to talk about veganism, they might well not have come across many channels that do talk about that. So hopefully we can again bridge that divide.
Yeah, I mean, without a hesitation, I would say to subscribe to Cosmic Skeptic, because I mean, a lot of the stuff that you do, and I mean the podcast. Look out for the podcast that's coming up, because a lot of the stuff that you do is really interesting on a philosophical level, and obviously I know that your whole content's not going to be vegan based, but I would like to see how that'll end up like obviously kind of reflecting the content you make, even accidentally, when you talk about moral philosophy, because I think it who we are ultimately does come out in what we do.
You have to jump through less hoops doing it. Like, you see people talking about morality all the time. Like I've been to Q&As, and there's always somebody who stands up and asks, like when Sam Harris gives a talk, they're like, "Oh, so what do you think of animal ethics?" And they're kind of jumping through hoops to try and construct this moral theory that allows them to exclude it, and it would just be so much easier to just be able to put out an ethical theory. And when someone says, "But what about veganism?" I just go, "Yeah." You don't have to do anything harder. Like, what about abortion? What about what about like this issue or that issue? What about gun rights or whatever it is? And I can just say, like, this just applies consistently, and I don't have a problem with how it applies, because I agree. Like, because like if you base it on welfare, you can say, like, yeah, like there isn't a problem with abortion, because you can say, like, that the pleasure of or like, if pleasure is the minimization of pain, the pain that a mother will receive from having to go through the childbirth outweighs the pleasure of the fetus as it's existed so far. So abortion is okay, and that's not a problem with the theory. But equally, you can talk about the sentience of animals in the same way that you can talk about the sentience of a fetus as worth less than a human being, but it not be a contradiction to still say you wouldn't eat the animals. Like, it just applies everywhere. It's so much easier. And in fact, talking about like persisting into the channel and the podcast, I've got a really, really great veganism guest coming up. It's not the person we were talking about before it started, because I haven't like properly reached out to that individual yet. It's someone else. I'll tell you who it is after we've gone off air, actually. But if people subscribe to the podcast, there is a fantastic guests coming on to talk about animal ethics, who I think will just be of great interest to anybody interested in this topic. So watch out for that episode of the podcast. Even if you don't subscribe to the podcast or whatever, just look out for that episode. I think it's going to be absolutely fantastic.
Oh yeah, definitely. I'll be watching it. Like I take a great interest in like philosophy, veganism, and stuff like that. So I think if you've got any, I mean, if you care about veganism as an issue or philosophy, I think you should be wanting to watch these things. I think you made a really good point, actually. I think in one of your videos, because you were saying like you are going to see certain like I can't remember who it was. I think it was Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris and stuff like that. And it wasn't like you were saying like even if you disagreed with the person who you are watching give the speech, even if you were like, nah, they're wrong, you would want to be there because you'd want to see like why they're wrong in the first place. You want to go like the place. I think you said the place I'd want to be is in the crowd, so that like that position where you know why they're saying these things, how they're arguing, and stuff like that. And I think even if you're like someone like, because I get even some like not anti-vegans, but like people who go against veganism, because I do veganism debates on this channel. And I think like a lot of the time they're even willing to participate, and I think that's really good. And I think it's really nice when people are willing to just engage with the ideas. So I really do look forward to seeing this. I think it'll be really interesting.
Oh, thanks a lot, and thanks for having this conversation as well. I think it's been I've really enjoyed this actually, because I've been thinking about veganism a lot thanks to the recent video, and my meta-ethics and ethics in general could really have done with updating and talking about. So this has been a really great conversation, I think.
Yeah, just like two last questions, really, just for the end, like just quick, because I think the vegan community will kill us if I don't ask you. Ironically, yeah. But so are you vegan now? And if you are, how are you finding the transition?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, so I don't know how long you have to not eat animal products to call yourself a vegan, but I've been abstaining. I've been, let's say, on a plant-based diet for it's not been long. It's been like half a week maybe, but it's been much easier than I thought. The main thing for me, right, is that I was thinking, and I haven't made a song and dance about it as well, because I don't want all of my followers to get scared off and think that I'm turning into a massive vegan advocacy channel, which I don't think like. Even if I wanted to convince my audience to all go vegan, like just practically speaking, that would not be the best way to do it. But what I have found, and I haven't really spoken about this, was like, there's a lot of paranoia about nutrition. I mean, the only thing for me now is nutrition. Like the ethical argument, the environmental argument, all that kind of stuff is, I swing completely one side, no question. The only thing left was like the nutrition, and there was a lot of information about nutrition, and I was thinking, God, how am I going to get my B12? How am I going to get my protein? How am I going to get this? And then I realized, like, hold on, as if I'm already thinking about this kind of stuff. Like where am I getting it now? Like, am I actually paying attention with my diet? And I absolutely am not. Like, I eat horrendously. And I suddenly realized, like, if I was suddenly had to pay attention to getting all the right nutrients, I'd be way healthier. So I found it's really easy. When I go to Costa, which I do frequently, like for so long, I went into Costa and I saw they had this new vanilla almond vanilla latte, and I thought it looked nice, so I ordered it, and I started drinking that regularly. It was only after I've been drinking it for like a month that I realized that what they meant by almond vanilla latte was a vanilla latte with almond milk instead of normal milk. And I wrote, and I didn't even notice the difference, and it was so easy. And then I realized like how easy it is to get protein from nuts, and how like you don't actually need as much as you might think, and that B12 is put into the soy milk or the almond milk that they use in the Costa, so I can get that from there. Like, yeah, it's so easy. It's been so easy, and that's only within like the first week. It's been easy in terms of supplementing the nutrients. What hasn't been easy is seeing the person next to me having a pepperoni pizza, which is like,
yeah.
For God's sake, this is just a massive injustice, because I can't even hold them morally culpable because they don't. I'm like envious of that. That's not been easy. That's the one thing that might make me have a few slips here and there, but I'm trying. Is the answer to your question?
Yeah, I mean that's really good. I mean, like, I guess the idea is like obviously this idea of like this envy and jealousy. Like I used to have that when I first like kind of went vegan. I was like, oh no. And then like I had this like this last meal. There was like the last supper of like a 14-inch like 14-inch like pizza and like cheesy chips and garlic sauce. And I was like, and then even when I couldn't even enjoy the meal. I was like, it's fine. Like I can't go vegan right now. It's my exams, you know. And like even when I was having the meal, I was like, I'm a bad person. I couldn't even enjoy it. I was sat there and I was like, this is vile. This is disgusting.
Yeah,
I was like,
because for me, because it's the same thing. It's like an emotional thing more than anything that finally drives you to actually have the motive to do it. I didn't plan to go. I wish I'd have known when my last meal was going to be, because like I had no idea that when the other day I popped into KFC and got a Mighty Bucket, that might well have been my last one ever. I love those things. I absolutely enjoyed them so much, and I just had it and I threw half of it away because I was like in a rush, and like thinking about that now, like my God, I don't even want to talk about it, you know. But
it's strange.
I was on the bus in the way to town, and I was going to be like doing some work basically. And my plan was to go to Costa and get there. They do this like sausage bap, and to get a latte and to do some work. And I was on the bus, and this cat tried to cross the road, like where my bus was going down. But then the bus kind of flew past, and it startled the cat. And the cat kind of like jumped back in fear of the bus from the road. And because I was on the bus, like the cat's like looking at me as the bus, and the cat was looking at me with this just terror in its eyes that I couldn't explain, and kind of backing away like an absolute terror. And so I went and had a vegan breakfast instead, because that just did it for me. I was like, what the hell am I doing? Like, what am I doing here? I cannot now go and know that's the kind of suffering that I'm instilling. I just couldn't do it. And so seeing that cat by chance on that bus is what made me go and get a vegan breakfast instead. And since then, I haven't had any animal products.
Well, I think that's brilliant, and I can just applaud you for that. I think that's a really good like connection you made there. Like when you're seeing the cat and caring about the cat, and then obviously realizing that like you'd be causing the same fear in those animals that you'd be eating. That's a really good connection that I think psychologically you'd like to make. I mean, like even especially if you understand that the motivation of individuals is related to how they feel and their emotional states. Like when you're biting into that, like for example, like me when I was eating the pizza, like I realized I don't think I finished it. I couldn't, because I realized that it just wasn't enjoyable, because I was looking at it, I was like, this is wrong. Like, and I think that it's like, I think the great thing about like to do that, to really give you that motivation, to give you that understanding of like to reinforce those values that you have is to be honest, to watch slaughterhouse footage. I watched like Cowspiracy and stuff like that, but then Gary Yourofsky, he was quite a powerful speaker at the time. Like he was very influential on me, and he was like, if it's not good enough for your eyes, why is it good enough for your stomach? And I think that was very motivational. I think like for example, if you've seen Earthlings, have you seen Earthlings or Land of Hope and Glory?
Yeah, I've seen a few of those types of things, and like
Yeah,
people don't want to watch them. They say like, stop just spreading this propaganda. It's like, no, propaganda is like cultivated. This is just what's actually happening. Just go and watch it. Like that's one of the challenges. I saw in a debate where one of the speakers said to the opposition, just said, look, if you guys are so confident that you're like it's fine and justifiable to be killing animals for meat, then would you send your colleagues a copy of one of these documentaries about what goes on in animal farms? And they were like, they couldn't answer the question, of course. But I think you're right. Like it's worth watching this footage, but don't watch it out of morbid curiosity. Watch it through a moral lens, because people always, everybody has seen slaughterhouse footage at one point or another because they're just kind of like morbidly curious. Like, take it seriously. Like, go and judge whether or not it's being adapted. Like some of these documentaries may well be trying to make it look worse than it is. They might say, look at this cow that's crying or something, when it's like, we can't know if the cow's actually crying in the same way humans cry. We don't know if it's got a wet eye or something. Like, don't take that. Don't take that kind of information. Judge for yourself what's actually accurate. But if it is accurate, then consider what you're actually seeing and whether it's worth what's on your plate. Like, even if it was half or a quarter as bad as what we're seeing, it still probably wouldn't be worth it. It still definitely wouldn't be worth it. So
exactly.
What are we doing here?
I think Land of Hope and Glory is a good one for that. It just shows standard industry practice, which is, I think, very influential. Like it shows like, okay, like abuse does happen, but it's like standard industry practice. This is what happens like every day, you know. I mean, if you start reading accounts deeper into it, you'll find that standard industry practice isn't standard industry practice. which is worse. It gets worse. But I mean, like, I don't think that you have to even go, as you say, even go into that, because you say, like, even if it was half as bad as what we thought it was, it's still too bad. But it's great to hear that you've taken these accounts into consideration. I will just say this. On points of nutrition, if you're ever looking for advice, I know Vegan Gains would definitely be willing to talk to you, because I think he was saying that he would help with nutrition. He's really good with nutrition. He does a lot of nutritional debates with veganism. Also, Mike the Vegan and nutritionfacts.org, like Dr. McGregor, they're really good. Nutritionfacts.org even has like an Instagram and stuff like that, and like they've really like put the studies that we have today, which show that like having a plant-based diet is more healthy, a healthy, but a good plant-based diet, not just Doritos and Bourneville, which is my diet.
I got so many tweets. Like, I saw people have been tweeting me like it's nobody's business since I made this veganism video. Like, it's insane the level of response I've had, and I've really enjoyed it. But I've had some pretty vitriolic tweets. Like, somebody tweeted, like, look at this article of this kid who contracted a disease because his parents were feeding him a vegan diet. And I read the article, and it was like the parents were feeding their kid like bananas and oat milk, and that was it. And I was like, give me a break here, man. And like you say, like, the information's out there. There are people there, and I've heard of many of these people, and like I say, that the nutrition thing was what I was considering. Like, I've now realized that it's not difficult, and even if it were genuinely healthier to live a carnivorous diet than a vegan one, like, so what? If you can be healthy being a vegan, even if you be more healthy eating meat, if you can be healthy eating a vegan diet, then there's just no moral excuse for not doing so, I don't think. But it's good to know that the nutritional information is out there, and like you say, like, people don't eat healthily anyway, so people care so much about nutrition when someone's a vegan, but
Exactly, yeah.
the only time they actually care about whether they're getting enough fiber or iron or whatever. Like, give me a break. Like, unless you spend every day of your life making sure you've got the perfect balanced diet and you're completely minimizing your risk of heart disease, like, I could easily see my dad arguing with me, like, having his cigarette, going like, but like, you're gonna get heart disease if you stop eating meat. It's like, come on. Like,
that's exactly right. Like, I mean, we're living in a society like with 40% overweight. I think it's 40% obesity and 60% overweight. We're not really a society that's sat there like, pumping iron, trying to get like peak athletic performance.
We're not health conscious in the slightest, until people need to be health conscious in order to try and argue against a conclusion that they don't want to accept.
Yeah, exactly. And then they don't even accept their own arguments for how to be healthy. So
it doesn't even work. So yeah.
No, well, thank you very much for coming on. It's been a really interesting discussion. I think that I'm surprised at how much we agreed on metaethically. I didn't realize your views had changed. Like, obviously, I don't think I don't know how far we agree on logically. I don't think it matters so much, actually. But it's really interesting to see how your ethics have developed. It's something that I was looking forward to hearing about, and you didn't disappoint. And obviously, your position with veganism is really well developed, and I'd like to thank you for coming on.
Well, thanks a lot, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk through the meta-ethics, because I've been wanting to make a video and stuff updating, but the easiest way to do it is just with a conversation with somebody who knows what they're talking about, which you obviously do, and it's been great fun. I've enjoyed being here.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who has watched the stream. Please go subscribe to Cosmic Skeptic, subscribe to his podcast, and hopefully we can see where this journey takes him. I'm really excited to see what future content can come out of it. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with the farmer. So was it? Oh no, you did tell us you were going to say who it was. I don't know who it's going to be.
I'm not going to say publicly. I'll tell you after we've gone off air. It's
okay.
Not a farmer, but it's someone who's got some pretty good things to say. I really wish I could take it. I'm so excited about it, but got to keep it under wraps for now.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way the game works, isn't it? Like,
you'll know when you see it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you again, everyone who has came. If you want anyone to, please show your support for Cosmic Skeptic in his journey for veganism. Show him some love. And as always, try to gain some perspective.